If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. My name is Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and a story editor, and I teach women who are writing in all genres how stories work so they can finish their books faster and without frustration.
And I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor, and poet, and I help writers identify and solve their story problems.
On today's episode, Melanie pitched She Said so that we can study turning points. This 2022 film was directed by Maria Schrader from a screenplay by Rebecca Linkowitz based on the book by Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey. Of course, there will be spoilers because we can't talk about the movie without talking about the movie. And as always, we would love it if you could help other writers find our show by leaving a rating and review. For Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Just go to the show's landing page, scroll to the bottom, click the 5 stars, and you're done. It's that easy. Okay, Melanie, She Said, how did you go with turning points this week?
Well, this movie actually intrigued me with regards to turning points in a way I was not expecting. So this is a really fascinating technique, I think, that these writers have used, or a reflection of what happened in real life. So here we go. Now, searching for turning points is based, or the way I do it, is based on finding the point just before there's a change in the unit of story. So this week, the 2 protagonists of the movie, Jodi and Megan, don't change. They are constant characters. Yes, they are driven, and there is a strong internal need for them to do their research and publish this story, but their determination and their worldview doesn't change. Now, instead, Jodi and Megan cause the turning points for the other characters. Some are on screen and others aren't. And as constant characters, the journalist's goal was to change the world around them and not necessarily change themselves. And we also saw this in All the President's Men, right? Now, I was watching the story unfold and recording the progressive complications and looking for challenges and decision points for Jodi and Megan. Now, they do experience many complications and frustrations, but what they need to achieve for their object of desire is to get people on the record. And what I was recording as I was watching were the victims' decisions, along with some significant decisions made by the men at Miramax who maintained their silence about Weinstein's behaviour. So, for Jodi and Megan, their goal is clear. They want to identify the systemic and deeply entrenched sexism and exploitative practices in the movie industry. Harvey Weinstein is recommended as a case in point. The 2 journalists never waver from their goal. They tried different interview tactics, starting with emails, phone calls, and then shifting to in-person meetings. The changes they make in their investigative approaches they're quite small, and they make headway in their investigation, but it's because people want to talk off the record. So what they need is evidence, either via documents, contracts, or attributable quotes, right? They need hard proof. So Megan and Jodi have to break down the barriers or get a big enough body of evidence to show the scale of Weinstein's behaviour. Now, once I realised that the turning points were not forcing the reporters to make decisions or to make changes, that it was the antagonistic forces working against them who were forced into turning points to make decisions, then I started to understand how the movie was constructed. So, for example, at the 1 hour, 38-minute point, during the 3rd meeting that Jodi has with Ryder, who is an accountant at Miramax, she shows him a story about Weinstein, from a well-known actress. Now, they don't say who it was, but she says to the other character that he will recognize who it was. Now, at this point, Ryder appears to be overwhelmed by the extent of Weinstein's behavior, and this is his turning point. He knows that Jodie wants proof and that he can provide it. And until this point, he's actually withheld that proof. However, he also knows that if Weinstein's lawyers treat him the way that they treated the women he abused, he is likely to be blackballed, and he is likely never to work again within this industry. So that is his choice at that point. That turning point forces him to make a choice. And we know, even if it isn't explicitly stated, that they are the consequences of his decision. And what he does is that he leaves the memo from a former Miramax employee open on his phone screen so that Jodie can take photos. And then he leaves. So finally, they have some written proof about the behavior and the people who knew about this particular person's behavior. Now, these type of turning points occur throughout the film. And this is an important difference in this movie. The storyline for each person Jodie and Megan interview has similar progressive complications, turning points, and crisis questions. So these people, or the antagonists, the forces of antagonists for Megan and Jodie, they know what happened is wrong. They know the reporters want to uncover the truth about Weinstein's behavior, but they still all say no. Now, the story pauses when each of the antagonistic characters are presented with a progressive complication. So each woman who was assaulted by Weinstein doesn't want to come forward, either because of NDAs or the shame about what happened, until they do. And that's when there is a global turning point in the story. Now, for me, that global turning point is when Weinstein announces that he is taking time off to deal with the issue. And this statement, and it's a public statement, is virtually an admission of guilt, because Weinstein and his protectors can't hide the truth anymore. So, and he is facing 2 investigations, and the skeletons in the cupboard keep mounting up. Now, Weinstein's statement is a progressive complication for the women that Jodie and Megan have interviewed. So shortly after this point, Ashley Judd says that she will go on the record about his behaviour, and then others follow very quickly. But what's also important to note is that she said is based on a true story. And this is a constraint for the writers, right? The screenwriters as well. They can either stay true to the events as much as possible, or they can choose to alter certain parts of the story for dramatic reasons. So she said, and all the president's men are similar, and the main protagonists and are constant characters as well through all the president's men. And they are also changing the world around them. So the reporters are subject to progressive complications, and their objective desire is at stake the more people they contact and the more people that won't go on the record. There is tension and conflict in She Said because of Jodie and Megan's struggle to get publishable evidence, but their story is about persistence right through to the end. Now, placing the progressive complications on the antagonists is unusual, even for stories with constant characters. So if I think about James Bond or Miss Marple, they experience progressive complications that build to turning points. So why is She Said so different? Now, I think it's because of the unique circumstances these journalists were in, and also the proficiency of Weinstein's lawyers. If the lawyers had left a paper trail, then the progressive complications and turning points Jodie and Megan experienced would have been different. Both reporters were also extremely ethical in their approach. They didn't take notes if someone asked for their conversations to be off the record. And they didn't seem to record phone conversations either. So the protagonists in this movie didn't face as many progressive complications as the forces of antagonism, but I think this is because it was based on real events. And there was a significant amount of time in the story that passed between turning points and a decision and the decisions that the characters were forced to make. So there were long pauses between those progressive complications and when the characters that had to make a decision did make their decision. Now, I don't think that this approach would really work for any other type of story, but I don't have enough time to dig into that a little bit deeper, although I find it incredibly fascinating. And it's something that I'll keep in mind as we watch more and more stories, and I'm thinking about this. So that's my assessment of She Said for progressive complications. How did you go this week with the villain's monologue, Val?
All right. Yeah, this one was interesting this week for sure. Before I get into She Said, let me just recap the theory on the villain's monologue for you. The whole purpose of this thing is to allow the villain, or, the antagonist generally, to explain why he's doing what he's doing. If there is no reason behind the actions, then basically the antagonist is bad for the sake of being bad. And from a storytelling perspective, that is really boring. It is super boring. It's the kind of character who is that stereotype of the mustache twirling cartoon villain. And we don't want to create that kind of character because that kind of character cannot carry a story. And remember, it is the villain who drives the middle build of your story. The villain or the antagonist, I'm using villain generally here to mean antagonist, they're responsible for at least half your story. At least 50% of your story relies on you having a great villain. The hero or protagonist is not going to change unless the villain or antagonist forces them to. So the reader needs to know why the villain is doing what they're doing. Now, ideally, in a perfect world, your villain also has a point. The audience or the reader doesn't have to agree with their tactics. In fact, generally, they don't because they're the villain and they're doing nefarious things. But explaining the motivation behind the behavior is a way where we as the audience, the viewer, the reader can say, well, I don't agree with how you're going about this, but yeah, this is a problem. That's definitely a problem, and the problem needs to be addressed. We need to do something about it, but villain, you are not going about it the right way. We do not agree with your approach. The villain's monologue can occur anywhere in the story, but it's at a major point in the story. It's at a key point in the plot. It can be delivered by any character, and it doesn't have to be a monologue. So there's lots of flexibility here. So when you're deciding how and when to put the villain's monologue in your story, think very carefully, because if someone other than the villain is delivering it, there's got to be a really good reason for it here. And I think She Said is a good example of this. Okay, before I get on to She Said, the other thing that I just want to point out to you that I haven't highlighted yet so far this season is that when it comes to the villain's monologue, we are dealing with pure exposition. Okay? All this stuff about show, don't tell, that's out the window here because tell is exposition. And this is pure exposition, and it's important exposition. Now, Melanie and I have a whole training called 10 Prose Secrets You Need to Know, because there's more to it than grammar. If you go to storynerd.ca/courses, you'll get more information there. But one of the things that we're teaching in that course is how to handle exposition. Okay, let's get on to She Said. I just gave you the theory behind the villain's monologue. That is a starting point, okay? The reason we study so many stories is to see how any given bit of theory applies in a particular context and with a particular genre. And She Said is a really interesting example. Melanie, you already said this. It's not a documentary, but it is based on actual events that we all know. A little sidebar here from a narrative drive point of view. It's really interesting because we're in dramatic irony. We all know what happened. So what this film is doing is telling us how it happened. So it's also an interesting study for narrative drive for anyone who wants to know more about that. Okay, back to She Said in the villain's monologue. Well, the villain here, and yes, I'm going to use the word villain and mean it. It's obviously Harvey Weinstein. Now, he's barely in it, though. We see the back of his head a couple of times, and he's on the phone a few times, but he's not in the movie as a physical, active character, the way we would expect to see the villain or the antagonist in a piece of fiction. We even get a snippet from Harvey's official statement that he puts out in response to the New York Times article. But you know what? None of these things is the villain's monologue because he never explains why he is doing what he is doing. And that is the purpose of the villain's monologue. In fact, Harvey says he hasn't done anything wrong at all. When he's initially given 2 days to respond to or refute the article, he refuses to give an official response. He just refuses to say anything, period. Then we see him come into the offices of the New York Times for a meeting with Megan Twohey, and it's him and 3 of his team. So there's 4 of them in the room and just one person from the New York Times, which is Megan. And it's interesting because the camera is situated outside of the meeting room. So we don't get to hear all of the exact words because that's not the point of the scene, right? The point of the scene is seeing how Megan is handling this room. And we see the way she's looking at Harvey Weinstein. I was going to say disgust. I don't think that's the right word. It's kind of almost disbelief, like, how could you? Or like, what kind of a person are you? But yet she's still very professional. It's for anyone who's an actor, I think it would be a really great scene to study because without saying anything, the actress whose name I'm completely blanking on right now, there's a lot happening in her face, even though she's barely moving and she's not saying anything. So it was really interesting. But if you turn on the closed captions, which is what I did to see if there was any insight as to what was being said in that room, that muffled conversation that we hear, from Harvey and his team, we hear things like, she's a shakedown artist. None of these women are credible witnesses. Nothing but thieves. She's a nut. So there's no explanation as to why he's behaving, why he does what he does. In fact, he is continuing to deny and he is trying to discredit. At an hour and 56 minutes into the film, and it's a 2-hour film, Harvey, on a phone call, threatens the New York Times with an exclusive interview with the Post, to which the editor of the New York Times says, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, call the Post. I love that character. And then Harvey says, as you said, Melanie, I'm going to take time off from the company. I want to spend some time learning. It's still not, first of all, an admission of guilt, but it's moreover, for the purposes of the story theory that we are studying this week, it's no explanation as to why he did what he did. At 2 hours and 2 minutes, so it was like this was just right before the closing credits come up, we see another New York Times editor pulling quotes from Harvey's statement, and this is what comes up on the screen. Quote, I appreciate the way I've behaved with colleagues in the past has caused a lot of pain, and I sincerely apologize for it. I'm trying to do better. Then the New York Times Article continues. He added that he was working with therapists and planning to take a leave of absence to, quote, deal with this issue head on. However, he denies many of the accusations as patently false. So, right up to the very end of the film, Harvey is not taking responsibility. So, we don't have anything from Harvey that qualifies as a villain's monologue that offers up any explanation. But there's still a villain's monologue in the movie. And I think it's really interestingly crafted. Again, if you're an actor, this is a great scene to study because I don't know who the actor is who plays Lanny, but wow, he did a good job in this scene. Okay. At an hour and 19 minutes, that's when the scene happens. It's delivered by Lanny, who is Harvey Weinstein's crisis manager and lawyer. Lanny is in a meeting with Megan, Jody, and Rebecca. Rebecca's one of the editors at the New York Times. Megan is asking the questions and Lanny is answering. So here's what Lanny says. Harvey adamantly denies any allegation of rape or assault. Nothing criminal. But he is aware of complaints about his treatment of women, and he is working on that. Powerful men of an older generation are changing their understanding of the word consensual, why women don't feel it's consensual even if a man convinces himself it is. I believe there is a story to be told about the evolution of men, and in particular Harvey, on this subject. Harvey was aware there was a problem with Rose, but not that she was accusing him of rape. So I draw a bright line on the word rape. Anything below that line he was aware of, feelings, concerns, a sense of exploitation because of that disparate power relationship. There's mental coercion that isn't physical coercion. Lisa Bloom has been working with Harvey to help him recognize the difference. Harvey had dealings legally with Rose about her concerns. I think he became aware that she did not regard what happened as okay with her. I'm not talking about rape. I'm talking about the effect he had on Rose McGowan. And that, rather than fighting, I think he has agreed to settlements rather than litigating what might have been litigated. As Harvey saw it, it was better to settle even if you haven't done anything wrong. Let's say for now, even on a background basis, that I need to find out what my legal limits are, even if on background I'm confirming statements, but the answer is yes, there have been. So there it is. Within this very long passage is the villain's monologue. And it's right up front. I mean, I read out the whole bit because it's quite extraordinary. But the villain's monologue comes in just like a line or two. And it's when Lanny says, powerful men of an older generation are changing their understanding of the word consensual. Why women don't feel it's consensual, even if a man convinces himself it is. So the reason Weinstein does what he does is because that's what men like him do. That is the motivation. That's the why. Harvey doesn't see any problem with what he's done. It's normal to him. And in fact, Lanny uses that word normal in a scene that comes a little bit later than this monologue I just read out. He says that 8 to 12 settlements for this kind of behavior is quote unquote normal. And Megan asks that specific question, is this normal? And he says, yeah, I would consider it normal. In this instance, the why for the villain's behavior is interesting, but weak and really, really stupid. The villain certainly does not have a point, and this is not exposition. The whole rest of the movie is exposition, though. And Melanie, you mentioned All the President's Men, and that's exactly the film that was going through my head as I was watching this. If you go back and listen to the episode we did on All the President's Men, we talk about how the whole thing is exposition. So this whole movie is exposition. It makes sense, in my opinion, that the villain's monologue is delivered by the crisis manager. And given what this story is about and the time in which it takes place, there's not much else that the writers could have put in, because this is not a work of fiction, right? They can't just make it up. They have to be authentic. They have to stay to the facts. They have to represent what actually happened, even though this is not a documentary, and there is certainly some latitude with certain things. There's not that much latitude. You can't just make that stuff up and put it in. Now, even if this was a story about Weinstein's trial, there still isn't anything that they could have said, because Weinstein did not take the stand in his own defense. He didn't give an explanation as to why he did what he did. And to this day, he hasn't admitted that he's done anything wrong. He has admitted to some vague wrongdoing, but on more serious allegations, on specifics, he has maintained his innocence. So for a villain to deliver his own monologue, this is really important. Okay, I know we're talking about a really serious topic right now, but even if what you are writing is pure fiction, this is really important. For you to have a villain's monologue, for a villain to explain why he's doing what he's doing, the villain has to acknowledge that he is, in fact, doing what he is doing. That sounds really obvious, but it's not always. So in this case, you've got a villain who won't acknowledge what he's done. Therefore, someone else has to acknowledge it and explain it away somehow, justify it somehow. Who else but the crisis manager? And what does he say? He says that men of that certain age, that's just how they are. That's normal for them. That's why he does what he does. So it's really interesting this week. Okay, Melanie, what have you got for the action step for this week?
All right, this week, I want you to look at who is being forced to make a decision in your story that moves them closer to or further away from their object of desire. Is the last progressive complication, otherwise known as the turning point, forcing your protagonist to make a decision? If not, then do you have pressure on the right character?
Oh, it's a good question. Do you have pressure on the right character? I like it. All right, that wraps it up for this week. Join us again next week when we discuss The Miracle Club. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For access to writing templates and worksheets and more than 70 hours of training, subscribe to my Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/Inner Circle. If you'd like to get tips about books to help you read like a writer, visit Melanie on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads at Melanie Hill Author, or find out more about her at melaniehill.au. And remember, story theory does not have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.